like that amazing journey that Swan has been on originated from a sense that the landscape was changing so drastically. And you mentioned neoliberalism as a big part of that. In terms of the prospects of public welfare, of a public welfare system, what are the prospects of that surviving in Britain today?
Well, obviously in Britain today, we are, as we are filming this, we are 2 weeks after the re-election, or the election of a Conservative government, the removal of the coalition and David Cameron's government coming in. Since the crisis of 2007-2008, all the main political parties in Britain have tied up to the notion of austerity, that there is a need for retrenchment, that we have to get the deficit under control, that the only way forward is to cut back on public spending, that the only way out of this is to bring the private sector into public service delivery. It's all deeply worrying, but it's also, I think, built on a series of flawed assumptions. The deficit, for example, well, you know, it's not necessary to deal with a deficit in a 4 or 5 year period. You can deal with a deficit over a longer period, and you can deal with a deficit by giving people jobs and well-paid jobs so that they pay taxes, and therefore the costs are offset by more people paying taxes and more people having well-paid jobs. The problem at the moment, of course, is that in Britain, we're following a strategy which means more people are unemployed, or have more tenuous jobs or 0-hour contracts, and therefore they don't pay taxes because they're in insecure employment, and they draw out benefits to supplement those wages, and therefore we subsidise employers to pay low wages, and therefore the deficit gets bigger and the public spending gets bigger, but it gets bigger in a way of reinforcing the power of the powerful and the rich at the expense of the poor. They talk about the debt. Britain has a huge debt. Most countries in the world have debt. Most countries like Britain have debt because we're always fighting wars around the world and they're expensive things. But again, it's like an individual with a mortgage. You don't have to pay off your debt in 4 or 5 or 6 years' time. If you take a mortgage, you pay it off over 25 or 30 years' time. You structure that payment in. And of course, debt is also related to your ability to pay. I'm a professor of social work. You're a student of social work. If we both saw a house in Liverpool that we wanted to buy, and it was £300,000, as a student, you and your partner are not really going to get the chance to buy that because your income at this point in time is such that no mortgage lender will lend you the money to pay that £300,000. As a professor of social work, if I go to a mortgage lender, they may well take a risk on me because my income is such that I can pay that back. So any debt is also related to your ability to pay. So it's about the ratio, it's about your income and expenditure ratio. And what people forget is that Britain is the 5th or 6th richest country in the world. We can afford to carry that debt, and we can afford to support the most vulnerable people in our communities. We can afford to provide people with benefits. We can afford for people to have decent jobs. We can afford to invest in hospitals. We can afford to invest in schools, but we don't do that. And what each of the governments have set up, each of the political parties in Britain have signed up to, is a notion that there is no alternative to drastic cutbacks in public expenditure, the consequence of which has been to rapidly increase inequality in this country. So what we don't realise is that the 1,000 wealthiest people in Britain today have doubled their wealth in the last 5 years, and their entire wealth, they're now worth £575 billion. That's between 1,000 of them. So what we could easily do is take half their wealth. My math isn't very good, but that would be around about £290 billion we could take off them. That would wipe out the deficit for years and years to come. So it's not about the inevitability of economics, it's about political choices that are being made here. And behind austerity, it seems to me that what we are really seeing is the fundamental transformation of the welfare state, that the political parties, in particular the Conservative Party, are using the shock and fear and the dread of debt and deficit to fundamentally transform welfare by opening it up to the private sector, so that private healthcare companies come in and make profit from illness, that big housing corporations can come in and make profits from housing, that Atos and G4 can make profits out of moving refugees and asylum seekers across the country and housing them in privatised prisons. And this is what is happening to public welfare in our country. It's been removed from the state and state provision and been opened up to the private sector, to for-profit organisations whose priority is always the bottom line. If you're a for-profit organisation, your bottom line is profit and shareholder profits, and that's your rationale. And if you're a public service, if you're a state-run public service, it should be about meeting people's needs and meeting human needs in that way. And there's a fundamental divergence between those two. So in Britain, I think we're at a key turning point in which the defence of public welfare is absolutely vital, because if we move away from that, we will make the lives of vast numbers of people imminently worse than it is at this moment in time.